and newsagents.
So we're joined now by David Dimbleby, broadcasting titan. Actually, I mean, this sounds really cringy, but actually one of my broadcasting heroes, really. I mean, when I was I used to watch you, David, when I was a kid, watching, politics-obsessed teenager in Birmingham, watching Question Time and so on.
Well, I'm flattered.
Well, you should be flattered, but we'll see where we go. You might not be flattered by the end of it. No, well,
it's only just because I've been doing it a long time.
Well, perhaps, but you know what? If you stick around for long
You're
enough,
a very young man. Well, I'm a very old man, so of course.
Well, there you go, exactly. Your book, which is very interesting. You have brought in a copy of your book and a copy of Dostoevsky's The Devils, but yes. I just only have a copy of Keep Talking, which is your book.
I only brought in my book, so I thought you might not have it.
Well, I do have it. I don't have The Devils.
I read the Dostoevsky on the train, and then I looked through mine to see if I said anything I'd forgotten.
Is Dostoevsky any good?
Dostoevsky, amazingly complicated. You have to have a notebook beside you to write down who's who.
Well, yours is much more.
I've never been good on names. So
yours is much more straightforward and very interesting. In terms of political broadcasting, I mean, in a way, the book is entirely about a kind of a history of political broadcasting, really, because you've been in it for much of its existence, certainly its modern existence, in one form or another, and watching all of your many, many different appearances and different general election nights. It is a catalogue of British political history in a way. How has it changed in that time, since when you first started?
It's changed because when I began, it had hardly begun, really. I mean, I wasn't there when Robin Day did his first interview with Harold Macmillan, which was the beginning of a serious attempt to cross-question politicians. Up until then, politicians were treated with kid gloves. So I was in very early on, when we used to do regularly, on Panorama, for instance, every year, a long 45-minute, 50-minute interview with the Prime Minister. And at a time when I think the idea of what it was you were allowed to do and what you should do in interviewing politicians was just beginning to germinate. And Robin Day, who in my mind was the best political interviewer of that period.
And since?
Pretty much so, yes.
Because you're right. I mean,
mind you, it's a two-way street. You can't be an effective political interviewer unless you have a politician who really is interested in what they're doing and wants to talk about it and persuade you that what they're doing is right. And if you engage in an interview, like so often nowadays, with a politician who simply wants to bat away any question and stick to a brief they've been given by their press people and all that, which is increasingly the trend, then you don't get very far. But in those days, I mean, Thatcher, I think, is that Macmillan sort of didn't, he didn't have any difficult questions. Thatcher was the first really interesting politician to me, because she had an agenda, and she was obsessed with getting it across. And whoever interviewed her, whether it was Robin Day, Brian Walden, me, anybody else, she took it really seriously. She wasn't there to bat away questions. She was there to persuade you that what she was doing was right. And so it involved a lot of work on your part to make sure you understood what she believed she was trying to do, and then to raise the objections to what she was doing. And it was a proper engagement.
And you write about her taking you up to the Downing Street flat for a whiskey after an interview, and that what was that like? I mean, that
she did a very weird thing. We used to do a regular yearly interview with Thatcher, and one time we went in and we were doing the usual, going the rounds of whatever the issues at the time were. But one of the ones, as ever, was the NHS, and she was obsessed with the idea that there was inequality of treatment between North and South. She'd had the statistics for the North and the South, and she thought that in the South you got much better treatment than you did in the North, which may well still be true. And so suddenly in the middle of this interview she said, I'm going to have a review of the entire NHS. We're going to conduct a complete, full-scale, wide-ranging review. And the people in Downing Street with her hadn't a clue. Her own people hadn't a clue what she was talking about. And they came up after and said, "What was that she said? What was that she said?" And it hadn't been thought out.
Spontaneously?
Completely spontaneous, it seemed. She then appointed a minister to do it. But anyway, we went upstairs and she said, "Would you like a whiskey?" And I said, "Thank you." She always had a whiskey after an interview, "Thank you very much." And she began going through all the statistics. And I sort of interrupted because I thought I really can't take another half hour of the stats on Liverpool as opposed to Cheam or something. And I said, "Could I just ring my wife?" And she looked at me archly and she said, "Yes, David, aren't we both lucky to have one?" Which was Dennis, her husband, who used to be her cheerleader. But it was such a revealing kind of power balance line, really.
But she enjoyed, as you allude to, I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about her is that she enjoyed the combat. Right? She enjoyed the combat of the interview.
And was nervous about it and worked very hard at it. And used to write to people afterwards saying, "How did you think it went?" to her own kind of friends.
Really? Yeah.
And say, I was very nervous. I hope you thought it was all right.
But you wrote in the book that political interviews, or the political interview, risk terminal decline, a victim of its evolution.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Quite simply that people less committed on policy than Thatcher, who was very committed. Blair was committed, but by then the idea of what you said on air had to be carefully thought through, and under Alistair Campbell's benign or less benign oversight, serve your political purpose had taken root. And I think Thatcher, for instance, used to really say what she thought. I think Blair was very calculating in what he said. And it was this beginning of being aware of the impact of political interviewing that led to politicians becoming more and more cautious in what they said. Until nowadays, frankly, very often you might as well not bother to interview them at all, because the blandness with which they answer, the way in which they avoid questions, the failure really seriously to engage with the huge political problems we have now, which are as massive as they were under Thatcher or Blair, clearly. And the willingness, I don't know whether you find this, but the willingness to sort of seriously talk about it and not just bat away your questions.
But is that partly because of us? People like us, either media, i.e. that we...
Well, it's partly because of... Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
I think it's partly because of the failure of organisations like the BBC to stick with the long interview form. I mean, the long interview form is very important. If you have half an hour, you can get somewhere, because they can't go on just batting away the question.
Also for politicians
if you have 10 minutes or 7 minutes on the Today programme, you can't actually get into the heart of the matter.
But also for politicians to be willing to submit themselves to that,
yes,
right?
That
I mean, if you go back again to I'm always so struck when you look and watch, sad political geek that I am, because they're all on YouTube and so on, but you watch the sort of old panoramas,
yes.
You watch old news nights, you watch, you see, like the Prime Minister, for example, Margaret Thatcher, Blair even, willing to subject themselves to long interviews to get their point across. I mean, that almost never happens now. I mean, Sunak almost never does it.
No.
Starmer almost never does it.
Remember Sunak's first interview as Prime Minister was on a breakfast sofa, wasn't it? Talking about some ludicrous... I wonder if he talked about some joke about what he was doing. But
they all do what they all want to do, and I've done this.
But this is very, very, very dangerous.
It is dangerous, but what they all want to do is do pool clips. I mean, I've done this, as a political correspondent many times. They just want to literally go and do the 5 minutes that you have with a designated pool reporter, and you can't really ask them any questions because it has to be clipped up.
Or, as Sunak did when he was Chancellor, deliver your budget, then go and sit in your own studio and have 8 political interviewers come in, given 5 minutes each to ask you questions, so they don't have a chance to do anything. I mean, the only time when this has fallen apart, interestingly, was Liz Truss. Do you remember when Liz Truss decided to give an interview? I can't remember when the moment was, just after just before she'd resigned, I think. And they thought that, we won't put her in front of some tough political interviewer like you. We won't give her a rough ride. We'll go to all the regions,
local radio stations,
and the local reporters, local political people were brilliant, because they all just said, what you're talking about? Have you been up here? Do you know what's going on? Because they had nothing to lose, because they weren't in the profession. I mean, the problem with the political interviewer now, I think, for everybody, I mean, you listen to what they say about it, is you have to do what the organisation you work for does. I mean, take the BBC and the Today programme. Nick Robinson's always saying, you get 7 minutes when Nick Robinson actually needs half an hour, to get anywhere. And this obsession with it's a two-way thing. It's partly because the organisations themselves believe that those long interviews are vote losers, viewer losers.
Ratings losers.
They probably are vote losers as well,
Yeah.
but they're viewer losers. That they don't do them. But I think it's a duty. It's a duty for a big organisation, independent or the BBC, to actually force politicians to do long interviews, because that's the only way you'll get anywhere.
As you describe in the book, I mean, you've interviewed all the prime ministers, I think, since Wilson.
Probably. I'm not sure.
Well, you've seen them come and go.
Not latterly, but yes.
No, but the bulk of them since then. How do you rate Sunak in terms of how he deals with the media and in general,
with the
in terms
media?
of his
Well, I mean,
and in terms of him as prime minister?
Well, he's in a deep ditch, isn't he? I mean, everybody's in a deep ditch at the moment because there seems no way out of the chaos that we're in, and the poverty and the breakdown of the health service and the breakdown everywhere you look. It seems to me we're in a slough of despond, and I don't think any politician has a way out of it at the moment. The constraints are too great. I think you yourself have written about it. There's no money. We have a huge deficit. It affects not just us. It affects Germany. It affects France. It affects Italy. It affects the United States. I mean, we're all stuck, and I think Sunak doesn't have any kind of magic wand to wave. But I agree that he doesn't, if that's what you're saying, he doesn't actually give you any clear vision of what he's doing, except he's going to try and reduce the deficit.
You always have to resist, I'm sure you'll agree with this, resist the idea and temptation that politicians were always better in the past and sort of more titanic in the past. But might it be... again, going back to the sort of 70s, you were around then, and when one thinks of the cabinet, say the 74 to 79 Labour cabinet at that time, and you think about, you had Wilson, you had Callaghan, you had Healey, Shirley Williams, Tony Benn, even some of the people that have been sort of lost to time, like, Eric Varley or Silkin and all of these sorts of people. They were...
John Stonehouse.
Well, John perhaps not Stonehouse. But these were big people. And they had big hinterlands. Or maybe you disagree. Maybe because you were up close to them, they didn't seem that big at the time. What do you think? Do you think politicians have declined? Or is that just always a temptation that we shouldn't go down?
I don't know that there's an objective answer to that. There's always a danger. I mean, what they used to say was politicians who'd lived through the war, like Dennis Healey, been at Monte Cassino or the landings in Sicily or something, they were people with, to use the crude word, real bottom, people with substance. And that may be true. But I think much more important is that I think politics then was a much more creative business than it is now. It wasn't trammelled as it is now by globalisation, by problems that nobody can really see a way out of. So maybe it was more attractive. There was a bigger difference between Tory and Labour than there is now, because both sides felt they had, on the Tory side, let the market, free the market up. On the Labour side, there was a lot to do with the NHS and with bringing in comprehensive education, all kinds of things. So there were real political divisions. I don't sense any very great political divisions at the moment. But I don't know many politicians, but I don't think people who go into politics are of a lower calibre or less committed. I think the political scene makes it almost impossible for people with original ideas that haven't been sifted and chewed over, by all their press people and by people like you, to emerge. It's a much more complex world, I think, than it was in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and indeed in the 90s. I think this century is much, much more difficult with globalisation.
Social media.
With social media. I mean, I'm not on social media, so I don't know what...
David. You should be. Get on Twitter. You were briefly, weren't you? The Dimblebot and all that stuff?
No, that wasn't me.
Oh, that was... I know it wasn't really. But,
no, I've never been on social media, so I don't know what the sort of the effect of the vituperative attacks on a politician.
Well, I think it makes them narrower. It makes them more worried. It makes them more cautious. Not least because if they make a mistake, if you had a politician make a mistake, if you were interviewing them in the 70s or 80s or 90s, it could just die. Yes. Now it just lives on.
on and on and on.
In
And the
perpetuity.
mistakes they made 20 years ago are picked up and regurgitated against.
But the jeopardy's less there.
Is it possible to be a politician without being on social media?
It's a good question. I think probably impossible in some form now. I think probably
because you kind of don't exist unless you're on social
because
media.
the arena of so much of politics now is social media, specifically Twitter or X as it's now known.
Yes.
You know, when they want to make an announcement, when they want to say something, sometimes when they're even interacting, it's done on Twitter.
Yes.
In a way that unimaginable even 10 years
but
ago,
then
15
you see,
years ago.
then again, I mean, someone like Trump uses Twitter. Well,
Yes.
now he's allowed back, isn't he? But
Yes.
Trump uses Twitter. You may hate what he says, but he uses it very effectively. So
Yes.
maybe
It is a tool. They use it well.
If you can marshal it well, it works. But I still have an admiration for people who go into politics. I mean, unless you're completely corrupt, there's not much money in politics. There's not much chance of getting ministerial office. You spend a lot of time in your constituency looking after people's problems, of a very mundane but important kind. So I'm not one of those who says, oh, what's the awful
it's an
thing?
ignoble calling.
Why vote for them? It only encourages them. It's really pernicious
I agree.
and dangerous. I don't think you can do that. And how it's going to change, I don't know. I mean, is the world going to change? Is the effects of globalization going to change? Is politics in one country going to become more feasible? Well, not attached to what everybody else.
Well, you
does.
talk about going into politics, and you've talked about Robin Day in the book, and of course, as you say, he had wanted to be a Liberal MP, and it didn't quite work out for him.
Yeah.
Had you ever thought about going into politics? Never even crossed your mind?
I'm a family of journalists. My great grandfather had newspapers in Richmond. My grandfather was the first political press officer for Lloyd George in the 20s.
Is that right?
First one ever, yes.
Wow, that's amazing.
There was a lot of criticism of it. They said, the Times, I think, wrote a leader saying, we're a bit uneasy about having a press officer. I always tell Alistair Campbell this. We're a bit uneasy about having a press officer because we'd rather hear from the horse's mouth. But he was the first press officer, and he was a political editor in the House of Commons. My father was less political, but a broadcaster. So
a very, very famous one.
Yes, but we've always been observers in that sense, I think, as a family. I mean, 4 generations of us have done that, and I've never had the instinct to be a politician. I'm interested in watching and observing and trying to explain and understand how power works and why power works. And I mean, I'm engaged now on a couple of series, one about monarchy. Called, I think the working title is "What's a King For," and the other about financial corruption, both for the BBC. And I find that's my métier. That's what I understand and enjoy doing.
And when you were looking at your father, Richard Dimbleby, of course, I mean, was it always, when you saw what he was doing in terms of, I mean, he really was a sort of pioneer in terms of commentary and political broadcasting and so on. I mean, did you just look at it and feel, I must do that?
No, I didn't actually. I wanted to be a lawyer first of all, and then he rather wanted me to go into the Foreign Office. But I slid into it because I always imagine it's because I sort of saw him enjoying it and thought it's an enjoyable way of life, and interesting. That really.
Reading the book, something that struck me was how often you were in trouble at the BBC, or that the BBC
Not
were
that
unhappy
often.
with. Well, I do. It comes across that way. I mean,
when you write a book, you write
That's
about
true.
the troubles.
You write about the fun
you don't
thing.
write about the
That's true.
herograms you had.
That's true. But I suppose, nonetheless, I suppose maybe it's inevitable over a long career, and both know what the BBC can be like and the scrutiny that you can get. So perhaps it's inevitable. But it happened quite a lot. I mean, obviously the most famous example, I was aware of this because I've seen the
Wilson.
researched it, the Wilson as Yesterday's Men and so on.
Yes,
that must have been extremely uncomfortable. I'm quite fascinated by Wilson as a political actor.
Yes.
But it must have been that interview that you describe in the book, and I've heard you talk about before. It must have been quite an experience. Just explain to people what happened there.
When Labour was defeated in 1970, it came out of the blue. The June election, the Rose Garden election, it was called Rose Garden election because Wilson thought it was a shoo-in, and it turned out not to be, and Ted Heath won. And Labour were absolutely devastated, but much more interestingly, people quite astonished that they'd gone. And they were the big figures you've talked about that had gone. And I did literally dream it up in the bath. I thought, what on earth can we do about this? I know. Why don't we? Because I'm interested in power. What's it like to lose power? What's it like suddenly to have it taken away? And so I sold the idea to the BBC of making a film called Yesterday's Men. Yesterday's Men was the title that Labour had used against the Tories in that very election. They're Yesterday's Men. So we used that rather mischievous title. And we went around, interviewed half a dozen or so of the top politicians. They were really good, half-hour interviews about how they were coping with being out of office. Then came Harold Wilson, which was the last interview. And I asked him a question that was done tongue-in-cheek, really. He'd written his memoirs, and the Labour Party had been complaining that he wasn't fighting in the House of Commons for opposition. He was busy writing his memoirs.
And he made quite a lot of money from those memoirs.
And they said he was making a lot of money. And I simply said, I think the question was, can you set our minds at rest about how much you really earned? And he exploded. I've never seen anything like it in all my television interviews, except once with Bill Clinton when I asked him about whether oral sex counted as sex with Lewinsky, and he exploded. But I thought it was a reasonable question. But anyway, Wilson completely exploded. And this this film is to be stopped. This interview is not to take place. His press officer, Joe Haynes, complained immediately to the BBC. The BBC cravenly said, no, we won't use it. Why not use it? And I think and then the whole thing then fell apart. They tried to the Labour Party tried to take an injunction to stop this film being shown simply because of this one thing. And the film was a really good film. I think it was, the BBC said they would never show it again in Wilson's lifetime. I think it has been shown since. But I think the crucial thing is, quite inadvertently, and this can happen in an interview, we touched on something that he thought I knew about, but I didn't, which was how he was being paid. And I think there was a tax avoidance measure he'd taken, which was to sell to the Sunday Times the book and get paid a lump sum, and you could not pay income tax. Now, some simple thing like that. But it was quite unreasonable, his reaction. And his first reaction was, where are these Daily Mail questions coming from? Did you ask him how he paid for his yacht? Ted Heath had won the election, who indeed had, suddenly out of the blue, had an ocean racing yacht provided, presumably by, hedge clippers who were hedge fund managers who were, we call them hedge clippers, but hedge fund managers who were, or bankers or something, who were wanted the Tories back in. But it was just a mad reaction. Then there was a full inquiry by the BBC, which went on and on and on. They analysed every interview that I'd done and all the questions I'd asked and whether they'd been given balance in the film. And we were exonerated, except for we had the scaffold of the pop group to make a wonderful song called They're Yesterday's Men and It's No Fun at All. We were criticised for that, and we were criticised for not telling people the title of the film. Like when we sat down, we didn't say, this is called Yesterday's Men, how does it feel? Which that was,
Did
reasonable.
Wilson talk to you again? Did Wilson
never
be interviewed by you again?
Never, ever. And one of his people wrote a thing saying, we'd always thought he was a friend. I've never been a friend of any politician. We always thought he was a friend. Marcia Williams.
You used the word craven there. Do you think the BBC has become more afraid of the government, of politicians, of power over time?
I don't know, because that showed they were running pretty scared.
And they were in opposition then. They weren't.
And
even
they were in
government.
opposition. I mean, I think there's always a sort of panic stations at certain points on politics that the BBC gets into.
I mean, you recount the story in your book of during the 97 election, where
during which election?
The 97 election. So it's you're presenting the 97 election programme.
Oh, the Blair victory.
And
yes.
And Blair has won, and obviously has won this enormous majority, 179. And you were doing what you normally do, and you were just being not bellicose or anything particularly, but you were being reasonably, just as you were with Conservative politicians. And then the director comes in your ear and tells you maybe to change your tone. Well,
it was an odd thing. There was a mood, you see. I think this was I had great admiration for this bloke, the director at the time, but he was editing Newsnight, which you used to be on, I think at the same time. And what had happened was that the Labour Party, Alistair Campbell again, being very savvy, had realised that when Thatcher came in her big victory, in 79, Downing Street was full of people cheering as she arrived at number 10. And so they thought we must do the same for Blair after his victory. So the following morning, when Blair came into number 10, there were people waving flags and Union flag and all that. And one of our reporters down there said, oh, these are all ticketed, actually all ticketed by Labour. So it wasn't the public. In fact, there were gates up on Downing Street then, so you couldn't just walk into Downing Street because of the IRA. They'd put gates up to protect number 10. And so he said, I remember these words exactly, steady on, David. You know, you speak to all the time during an election. Steady on, David, this is a very important moment. And I thought, that's odd. And then a day later, there was a funny period when he suggested that political interviewing should change because Labour had in some way created a new consensus about what should be done, which is a view that he actually withdrew after 2 or 3 days. He realised it was nonsense. But there was a moment when there was a kind of the idea that there was a sea change had to be reflected.
The BBC is good at that, isn't it? It's quite good at sniffing out where power is and where received wisdom in the country is, and it feels nervous about stepping too far outside of it. And that received wisdom could be left or right. It's not necessarily political as such.
Where would you be today, for God's sake? I mean, you know, I think the BBC is in an incredibly difficult position now because every minority, every grouping is now so vociferous. And if you're the Director General of the BBC, you're bombarded day after day after day by pressure groups on every issue. And at the same time, you have this statutory duty to be objective, whatever objective means, and to reflect all these opinions. I mean, I think it's getting harder and harder, but nonetheless essential to try and keep a BBC that's not like.
Do you think the BBC has been insufficiently pugnacious? Do you think it has not defended itself enough?
I think at times it hasn't.
Because the attacks have probably got more vociferous, you think, in recent years?
I think you have to be pugnacious. But then, you know, you have Nadine Dorries as Culture Secretary saying she's going to stop the licence fee in 3 years' time or 4 years' time. I mean, she's gone now, and a good thing. But I mean, a good thing too. But if the BBC exists because of public goodwill towards it, and that means, in a way, public goodwill expressed through Parliament and through the government, and so. The dangers of you can appeal to the public goodwill, but if the government itself is against you, it's a headwind that you're always worried about. I think.
But those attacks
about losing, because the worst thing to do would be to lose the BBC altogether.
But those attacks have become more vituperative.
They have, but funnily, when Thatcher was in power, I remember talking to her once. I said, "Why you always said you were going to bring the BBC to heel? You were going to cut it down to size. Why didn't you?" And she said, "Because every time I tried to, people come out of the woodwork to defend it." And those were in the days when there was only BBC and ITV. Barely commercial radio had started, you know. And people valued the BBC. So you have to it's a tightrope. You've got to keep doing the thing that makes the BBC special, come what may, and at the same time try and explain to the politicians why it ought to matter to them that the BBC does occasionally offend them, upset them, and isn't just in their pocket.
But that didn't happen in the Boris Johnson years, in particular.
It didn't.
Something started to change, didn't it, in those years? I mean, you already mentioned Nadine Dorries and the fact that when Boris Johnson was just in a hole, they just announced the fact that they were going to abolish the licence fee without anything to replace it. Johnson constantly railed against the BBC.
Yes.
All the time, in a way that, I mean, it's always happened, but something changed in the last few years.
Do you think it's gone back now?
I think probably to some extent under Sunak it's gone. They're less pugnacious in the other direction towards the BBC.
I'm sure. I don't know who you have to ask to find out. I mean, you know that the BBC's it's permanent, and all the time it's being surveyed about how popular the BBC is with the public and all that. But I don't know whether the politicians are changing. Do
you think the BBC ever recovered from Savile?
Yes.
You think it's recovered its self-confidence since then? It was such a terrible...
No, but Savile, I made a whole series of programmes years back called Days That Shook the BBC, and one of them was about Savile. One was about Savile, and I mean, some people think that people within the BBC knew what was going on. I'm not absolutely convinced that they really did. I mean, at a junior level they may have done, and the BBC may not have been effective in picking up the message about what was happening. But I saw it as one very, very hideous operator somehow getting away with it. But I never believed the BBC connived in it or anything like that. I mean, I don't think anybody ever said, oh, it's just...
Did you ever cross paths with him yourself, Savile?
What?
Did you ever cross paths with him?
Never, no. Never. I saw him once. I remember thinking it was a very weird man. I came down on a train from Leeds after Question Time, and no smoking carriage, yeah? And he was sitting at the very back of first class in a hideous kind of white jumpsuit, smoking a huge Havana cigar. And I thought, what is it about that man that he's... Nobody can touch him? You know, why didn't somebody say you can't smoke in here? And then I was hearing rumours about what was going on in the, you know, the hospitals and in the mortuaries and all that. That was all being talked about, but never a finger on it. I didn't know, you know, I don't think anybody actually knew what was happening. So, I mean, obviously some people at a very low level knew and probably kept quiet about it, I don't know.
So here's something I found fascinating about the book. Obviously there's a whole section on election programmes. You don't like exit polls. You're sort of the master, the king of the exit poll, and you don't like them.
I'm not the king of the exit
poll. Well, no,
poll.
John Curtis, I suppose, is the king.
John Curtis,
but you're at least the
David Butler,
crown prince.
David Butler. No, I
man.
just broadcast what I'm told to broadcast.
But you don't like exit polls. Explain
I don't like
exit polls
because they spoil the fun. When you 5 minutes to 10, you get the result, or you don't get the result, or you get the wrong result, and you have to announce. And at 10 o'clock, we can reveal what our exit poll says. Labour's back with Conservatives back. It's going to be a hung parliament. Well, if it's obvious, what on earth's the point? How do you keep people watching?
Well, you've got to have something to talk about for the next 3 hours.
Yeah, and what do they say? All the politicians come in and say, "Well,
it's just an exit poll, David.
It's just an exit poll. Let's wait till we get the. Let's just wait till we get the results in. You know." Like, well, you remember? I tell you what, the best example was Farage, Nigel Farage on the Brexit night, 2016.
Oh yes.
The exit poll was showing, and he was saying we've lost. You know, 2 hours later he was saying, "Oh, funny that, seem not to have lost."
But you get the.
Polling is a mysterious business, and I have a huge respect, and I love John Curtis's work, and I mean I watch every little.
But it is amazing. I mean, I've done two. As a guy, I did 2 election programs with the Sophology for it, and it is an amazing.
Did we do one together?
No, we didn't. No,
did we not?
No, unfortunately
sure?
not. Alas, no, because there's still time. But the sort of the magic around the exit poll and getting the. I mean, the first one I did was in 2017 when obviously everybody thought May was going to win. And then suddenly they came in having opened up the exit poll and said, oh, have we got a coalition builder?
I did 2017.
I know you did, yeah.
So we did do
no,
one
but I was
together.
at Sky then. I was at Sky. I did it for the Sky programme.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And it is a sort of extraordinary bit of kind of political theatre, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, but the whole election, I mean, the glory... if you like being centre stage, which I have to admit at times I do rather like being centre stage at a general election, there is absolutely nothing to beat it. I mean, you walk into that studio, this huge studio with maybe 150 people in it, all analysing things, other people doing interviews, people down the line, people explaining and re-explaining. I mean, it's a thrilling thing to be master of ceremonies of. It's tongue-in-cheek to say I don't like the exit poll. What I mean by it is, if an exit poll says the game's up, you know, then it's... But in the next election, my guess is the exit poll will be...
Well, we do election
like that, won't it?
There's one thing, talking about British exceptionalism, there is one thing we do better than I think any other country, which is election nights. The drama of a British election night is so much better than almost anywhere else.
Yeah, but that's so obvious because it's first past the post.
Because it's first past the post, exactly. And
650 constituencies, and it's not... I mean, the worst, shall I tell you the worst? I went to Canberra once for the Australian elections. My God, they're boring.
BBC sent you to
yes.
Canberra? Oh, God, I was born too late.
I know, yes, you were born far too late. No, those were the days. But we went to do exit poll we went to do the election in Canberra, and all it was polling creeping along, you know, and this means there's...
Even the American ones, as you write about, are pretty boring. Because
Americans are very boring.
Yeah, it's all ABC calls this and all that. Yeah. But
I tell you what, I mean, you can say what you think about, you know, our first past the post system, but what it does do, which is really important, is it engenders a real excitement in politics.
Yes,
and I do think politics has to be exciting.
I agree. Yeah.
People have problems of their own, but actually at some point, even if it's only once every 5 years, for people to focus on the fact that these people are going to I was going to say decide what your life, they may have some influence on your life. That's a magical moment.
People often underestimate the importance of politics being interesting. People often complain in the last few years saying, "Oh, politics is so much going on; it's too much." No, politics should be like that. It shouldn't be a dry pursuit.
But it's been murky and complicated for a long time.
I want to just on election night though. I mean, obviously the most well-known, or perhaps one of the most famous, really, ones that you've done now, certainly recently, of course, was the Brexit referendum night.
Yes.
And there is one bit of it that obviously has lived on and will always live on, which is the bit where you announce the result. You say that the British people have spoken, the common market decision of 1975 has been reversed, and that's it, we're out. Some people have criticised that since, because some people have said that it produced a moment of finality, that some people watching it might even think, right, that's it, that is it, we're out now. And that maybe
Brexit means Brexit.
But in the sense that as if we would wake up the next morning and we were out. And of course, it was only the beginning of a process, and that maybe it was the kind of wrong emphasis in a way.
It's a quibble. No, that's rubbish. No. The thing I tell you what, though, the BBC very fastidious about any results of democratic vote. They wait until it's absolutely impossible for it to be wrong, and they kept us waiting. And we had this whole chart of the whole country, every constituency, showing which way it had to go if it was to be pro-Remain or pro-Leave. And it was perfectly obvious what was happening, but John Curtis wouldn't allow us to say for certainty. And when it came, I didn't know what I was going to say, really. I hadn't thought about it. I kept talking. You talked from the thing to the director. I kept saying, can't we say it now? Come on, it's 4 a.m, for God's sake. It's perfectly obvious what's happening. No, just hang on. And it was around about 4:20 or 5:20. And I suddenly thought, oh boy, I better say something, because this is a big moment. I can't just say, oh, well, the vote's gone this way. And I suddenly remembered I'd done the 75 referendum when we went into the common market, it was. And I just scribbled down a little note to myself, and that's it, we're out. Because that's what it was. We're out. We'd voted to leave the EU. Well, there you go.
I want to move on from the BBC, but I want one other question about it, which is, do you think, we've obviously had quite recently, the controversy over Richard Sharp, the BBC chairman. You yourself was interviewed for that position at different times, I think. Do you think that it's time the government stopped appointing the chairman of the BBC?
Or anything?
Well, yeah, or the members of the board, for example, and so on.
Well, chance to be a fine thing. I think that you look at the appointment of Duke Hussey by Thatcher, who sacked Alistair Milne. I think it's wishful thinking that these powerful positions won't be appointed by the government. But what one hopes for is that, I tell you another one, Harold Wilson appointed Lord Hill to be chairman of the BBC because he thought he'd favour Labour, which he turned out not to. Do
you think the licence fee is going to survive
somehow?
Beyond
yes.
10 years, say?
Oh God.
Can it? Should it survive? Obviously, it's a very old institution.
Yes, it is. And you'd never have, as I say, you'd never have started from here, would you?
No.
When it began, it was voluntary.
Yes.
It was literally.
And just for radio, of course.
Well, like PBS in America.
Yeah.
Just for radio. I think in some form, I can't answer that. I do think in some form it should. What would be worse is for the money to come directly from the Exchequer, because then it's absolutely under their control. The one thing that could be done is to make it fairer by tying it to families' wealth. And there's always been this notion about tying it to the rateable value of a house. But the trouble with the rateable value of houses in this country is that they haven't been altered, so they don't represent any longer the difference between a house worth £2 million and one worth £250,000. It's not reflected. You could maybe find another way of doing that. Do I think that it's difficult, isn't it? The media is falling apart everywhere from what it was, this sort of, and desirably so, really, that it's not just the BBC. I remember when ITV started, everybody was aghast, At the BBC, this was seen as the enemy at the gate. The BBC knows how to do these things. Well, the BBC's lost all that arrogance, I think, and its view that it's the only one entitled, and all that went ages ago. But I still think there's an argument for a public service broadcasting who isn't dependent on advertising, isn't absolutely dependent on audience size, Because there's a lot of information out there you need to get out.
I mean, the scrutiny is incredible though, on the BBC, isn't it? I mean, we've even seen that, and for good reasons and for bad reasons. I mean, we saw recently, even with Hugh Edwards, for example, the scrutiny that he received.
Yes.
I mean, perhaps that would have been unimaginable a few decades ago in terms of news presenters and so on. I mean, what did you think about all that?
I wouldn't talk about it. I think it's not fair.
Not fair about. I just mean.
Not
I don't
fair
mean
to
about
him and not fair to the BBC.
I don't mean about him really. I suppose it's just a cultural thing. I suppose isn't part of that around the fact that there is now such an obsession with BBC from the papers and so on, BBC presenters, BBC stars, so called, and so on.
There've been other events in the past that have had just the same attention, but let's not go into that.
Something I was really struck in the book, when you were talking about one of your sort of more non-political roles at the BBC, doing state of occasions,
yes,
commentary and so on, you said you didn't like deference. Now, I find that so fascinating because I think for a lot of people, they might associate you with deference. I mean, no, I think they would because, you talk in these hush, and you do it brilliantly.
Don't use hush terms.
Well, hush tones, this sort of, and there's, the Marquess of Cholmondeley walking along there with the sort of orb of destiny or goodness knows what. And that's your job, that's what you're doing. But in a sense, some might say that you're part of that deferential system then in the commentary.
Well, I've always been very puzzled by it, to tell you the truth. I mean, I do the commentary I've done those commentaries on state occasions because they're interesting broadcasting, and in a way, along with elections and political interviewing, actually I can make a whole along with elections, political interviewing and reporting, but it's one of the facets of broadcasting that I found really interesting about how to comment on pictures that actually virtually speak for themselves, and how to the technique of doing that, of just, I think I say in the book, of being like somebody sitting on the sofa saying, that's the king, that's the Marquess of Cholmondeley, that's the golden orb or whatever it is, and just describing it. But I've never been one to sort of eulogize that. And in fact, I'm working on a series now for the BBC with the title "What's a King For?" because I'm absolutely fascinated by why we have a monarchy, how we sustain a monarchy in these days, what it means to people. I have no answers to the questions, but I think the questions are really interesting.
And as you again reflect on in the book, the BBC's particular role with the monarchy, which can be a tortured one and a difficult one, and it never quite knows whether is it supposed to subject it to the same scrutiny as any other public institution, or is it there in some way to affirm it? And it doesn't perhaps know the answer.
And that's one of the questions I'm going to be asking.
What do you think the answer should be?
It's early days. I'm not dodging your question.
No,
I genuinely don't know the answer. I mean, the only thing that is curious is the number of other European monarchies there are, where countries have opted for a monarchy as the best way of avoiding having a president running head of state. I mean, at the on the day of the coronation, I was in Paris, not here in London. I was in Paris, and we were at a cafe having a cup of coffee, and the waiter took our order and then said, "Mais qu'est-ce que tu fais ici? Pourquoi vous êtes ici? Nous avons tué notre roi. Vous couronnez votre roi aujourd'hui. Vous devez être à Londres."
Can't do subtitles on podcasts, David.
Well, we killed our king. You're crowning your king today. Why aren't you in London? And I said, well, because I don't know. But it's crazy. And he was going home to watch the coronation that night. And he loved the crown, everything. But there's a fascination with monarchy. And I'm intrigued by monarchy and how it works. And I think the BBC hasn't actually ever looked at that. You're right. I mean, it does its job at jubilees, state opening of Parliament, trooping the colour, or colouring the troops, as a wonderful American commentator once called it. And it doesn't look at the finances. It doesn't look at the power. It doesn't look at the working, why it works, or if it works, which is what I'm interested in.
Something else I think other people might find surprising, maybe just to finish, is you said recently, I don't find it easy to talk to people. I'm always tongue-tied. I never know what to say to people. I'm not very good at chat. I've got no chat. As a man who spent his life talking and chatting and broadcasting, That's quite surprising, isn't it? That's a bit of a paradox. Not
Well,
a
you've been
Dimbleby
asking me
paradox.
questions, haven't you? Which is easy.
That's true, but not just with me. I mean, in general, you've just described it there. You know, you said millions and millions of words on the television over decades since the 1960s, and yet you feel shy, or you feel...
Yeah, shy. No, what I was talking about really was in social situations, not working. I'm fine talking to you. You know, we're on the same wavelength. But if I go, this sounds really stupid.
Go on.
Well, I mean, for instance, if I go to a party, even if it's a broadcasting party, which I don't really go to very often, or go to a party where there are politicians, which I again don't often do, I actually can never think of anything to say. I don't know what to say to people. That's all. I'm in my head. I like listening. In fact, that book ought to be called Keep Listening, not Keep Talking, really, because I'm better at listening, I think. I mean, I think listening is what broadcasting's about.
Is this why you've taken up smoking in your 70s? Out of sheer stress. I read about that as well.
That's a white lie.
Should finish, I think. What would your be, if you could go back into that question time chair position for one night, and you could have your best five guests? Go on.
I won't do that.
No, go on.
It's like, who would you have at your, if you had a dinner party? Would you have Socrates?
Well, exactly. But you must know. I bet I know what you're going to say. I bet you would say like Ken Clarke.
Well, no, that's just going backwards. I mean, in the great panellists, there are... Question time is exactly a reflection of the political status quo at the time. So the best question times were always when you had these outspoken big beast politicians. Tony Benn, Ken Clarke, Shirley Williams, didn't give a damn what they said, didn't care for being ticked off by Conservative Central Office or the Labour Party afterwards. They just said what they thought and believed that engaging in politics that way was what mattered. And you did actually say things that your Prime Minister or your press officer might not want you to say. You said them because politics is a serious business and you have to engage with people. So of course those are the people I would go back to, not mealy-mouthed politicians terrified they're going to be ticked off when they get back to headquarters for not having said this and not having said that. Of course. And that's the change in politics, and it's to do with all the things we've been talking about, social media and global problems, which make it much, much harder to take a stand and say, this is what we should do. Look what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. This is what we should do, and bang, out he goes. So it's...
Do you think he was treated unfairly?
No idea. What, by the electorate?
No, by the political culture.
Rules. I don't know. After my time.
One more... the BBC rang you up and said one more general election, David?
They're not going to do that. Listen, the work for a general election begins 5 years before it.
Yeah, but you've done enough of them. You've got enough practice under your belt. If anyone could do it, you could do it.
Don't tempt me even to think of the question being asked or of answering. It's completely out of the question. The BBC's got to find somebody new to do it.
David, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.